Hello everyone, I'm that Athiests and welcome to my first video. I've been wanting to start a philosophy YouTube channel for a long time as I'm a PhD philosophy doctoral student and my interest area, and I haven't gotten around to it for a very long time until I found a video from Unapologetic Apologetics making a new argument against atheism that I haven't seen before that I wanted to address and inspired me to make this video, and hopefully this sticks so that I can actually start doing more videos. Now, the exact video that is in question is titled Checkmate Atheists by Unapologetic Apologetics. It's about 2 hours long, and the main thing I have a problem with is about the first hour. Now, most of that is actually not really relevant to the principled argument that I'm going to be referencing that he gives, and the other half is related to other arguments for God that I think other videos, plenty of other ones have addressed, but I could also eventually address them myself, but I'm not going to here. Those are like the fine-tuning argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, and such. So I'm going to just focus on the one I haven't heard before, which I'm going to call the Determinism Argument, and we'll get on from there. So, at 11:17 in the original video, he presents what I call the Determinism Argument, and of course the video is linked in the description if you want to find it that way, and of course you can Google it or YouTube search it with the name of Checkmate Atheists from Unapologetic Apologetics to find it yourself. And I encourage you to go watch it, at least parts of it. The claim that Unapologetic Apologetics wants to connect that is, if determinism is true, what he calls materialistic determinism, then one cannot generally have knowledge. And this is a very strange argument to me, but let's first break down how he tries to make this case. Now, it's important to note that there's a few suppositions going on that he's starting with. One, that if you're an atheist, that you have to accept a materialistic deterministic universe. That's not necessarily true, but since I roughly accept what I would call determinism, I'm going to take it on here and not really address that supposition. Though, of course, I would qualify it slightly differently, since in determinism, it can sometimes be construed as like a fatalistic case of the universe, where the laws of cause and effect can only go one way, and then the world will operate in that way. And since nothing will change, you can, if you had enough knowledge, you could predict how everything would work out based on laws and cause and effect. However, since there are certain things like we might imagine if quantum states are like truly random, then maybe it's not fatalistic. But either way, how quantum states and the collapse of the wave function is not up to your mind. So that would still mean that our minds are determined. I don't think it's a particularly big cleave. I just thought I'd throw it out there. So he has that first supposition that if you're an atheist, you have to do that. We'll accept that for now. Additionally, he's assuming that if determinism is not true, if we have a sort of free will, if that's true, then that would also correspond or lend credence to the idea that there's a God, or I guess something spiritual or supernatural that allows for that. That's also unclear why that would be the case. I don't know why we couldn't have a natural free will where there's, I don't know, in theory, if we're already in this weird place of libertarian free will, that there couldn't be this instance of consciousness just escapes like the fundamental reality as we understand it. But that doesn't have to have an agent type of God doing anything to do that. It could just be that's the way it is. That's another supposition he uses or will have to rely on if he's going to ultimately connect his claims. So we're going to keep that in mind, but that's not where I think the argument necessarily goes wrong either, so I'm not going to focus on that either. The main thing I have an issue with is how we get a connection between determinism, materialistic determinism being a true idea, and that would somehow imply that we cannot have knowledge. So how does he try to make this case? Well, first he says, look, any beliefs that we have about the world would be determined by forces outside our control if materialistic determinism was true. That's because, you cannot change the states of matter in your mind, and your mind would make up your consciousness, and that would make up your thoughts. You would have a set of like genetic predispositions, you'd have your upbringing, all these things that make you think in certain ways. That's how determinism just works. Everything that happens to you is not ultimately within your control. It was sort of something that more or less happened to you. You happen to be that way. So if determinism is true, then yeah, it would be true that any belief we have would be determined ultimately by forces outside our control. But somehow, if beliefs are not under our control, then you cannot step outside this thinking to properly evaluate that belief. This is a very strange claim to me, and I'm going to go to the next slide where I sort of break down the different ways we can try to make the connection that if beliefs aren't under our control in this kind of way, then we cannot properly evaluate the belief and therefore cannot have confidence in it. What Unapologetic Apologetics says is that the only thing we could really know in a deterministic universe is that we believe certain things to be true, but we don't actually know them. We would know that we had a bunch of different factors that made it the case that we believe these things, but this wouldn't necessarily line up with what the world is objectively, such that we don't actually know what the world is like. Also, he adds in that if we reject determinism, then the individual in some sense can step away from their brain to appeal to what he calls non-physical modes of thought. This is starts at 1556 in the original video. And these non-physical modes of thought he thinks are things like, general reasoning, logic, abstraction of a sort. Again, a little bit unclear, but we'll try to break down a little bit more in the next slide. There are two plausible ways of connecting the idea that if the universe is determined, then we can't know anything. I don't know exactly which one Unapologetic Apologetics has in mind. I suspect it's B rather than A, but I'm going to give both for the sake of being, robust and covering all my bases. The first idea, A, would be that volition is required for knowledge. And it's the idea that without choice, one cannot reason themselves into a position, since one would adopt that position regardless of reasoning. If the universe is determined in a materialistic way, then say if it's like from the Big Bang, then the laws of cause and effect will determine what I'm going to think before I get there, which means that I cannot choose to check it via reason at any point. Or if it's, not determined from the Big Bang, but based on some quantum mechanics bullshit going on, then we still have the problem of that's not under my control. I'm going to end up thinking once the collapse of the wave function occurs, or multiple ones of that collapse. But either way, what I end up thinking is already going to be set in stone before I think it. And thereby, I cannot actually choose to reason and check my belief in the right kind of way. I'm going to adopt this belief based on how the universe works, and that's going to be independent of reasoning. And I cannot choose to reason my way out of it because I've already been forced into this way of thinking. The second position, B, would be that knowledge requires access to modes of thought that are independent of cause and effect. What types of modes of thought those are is what Unapologetic Apologetics calls logic or reasoning. And it's the idea that these things, like logic and reason, would reach the same conclusion irrespective of my particular starting point or anyone's for that matters. If we are both being logical or if we're both engaging in a reasoning process, we should reach the same conclusion irrespective of our starting points or particular genetic conditions or background or upbringing or anything like that. That logic and reason will reach conclusions based on like a priori ways of making distinctions and such that, again, wouldn't depend on when you started at a particular time. It doesn't depend on cause and effect in any kind of way. And then it would be very, very convenient that if the states of the world constantly determined us to follow these principles of reason, that we're actually going to follow what logic says or what reason says rather than what the states of the world will determine our minds to think. And ultimately, it's the idea that, look, if we are determined, we cannot access independent modes of thinking that are independent of cause and effect because we are cause and effect. We cannot go into a world that is away from cause and effect because we already narrowed down to the world of everything we think is cause and effect, at least in the proximate before it reaches our consciousness kind of way. So these two would both connect the claims that determinism means that we can't know anything and be the bulk, really the hidden bulk of Unapologetic Apologetics argument. Now, hoping that I've made everything clear so far, let me get into the different points of how I will rebut his arguments. The first point that I want to get to is that Unapologetic Apologetics lacks a robust definition of knowledge. This is a problem because it's still very unclear to me why determinism, even if we adopt either the A or B connecting ways of thinking, it's unclear to me why determinism would have any impact on knowledge. How are we defining it? If we define it as justified true belief, a determined mind can have a justified true belief irrespective of whether, again, what determined them to think that way, because either they have a justification, a belief that is true about the world, or they don't. And if they do have a justification and a true belief, then we should call that knowledge if that's what we adopt. Again, that's a very common way of doing it in epistemology. There are other ways, but I would like to know the particular definition of knowledge. Of course, unapologetic apologetics would probably be trying to say we don't have a justification if we adopt either connections because we cannot be confident anymore because we can't access proper reasoning based on either connection, which is why we might doubt it. But if that's the case, then we'll just fall back to my other arguments. But still, I don't know why we can't have justification just because we're determined to think in a kind of way. If I'm determined to have a justification, it seems like then I can have knowledge. Second, look, determinism and free will divide upon volition. But volition is not relevant for assessing truth or falsity. This is what I'm going to say makes the A connection a little bit weaker overall, because I don't need to choose anything in order to reach beliefs. In fact, belief is not about a choice at all. I will reach a belief based on how I'm forced to think, but what I'm forced to think with are things like reason. I am forced to, have a grasp of logic, and I've learned logic, and I have to think in that kind of way. I cannot make myself believe that I have an elephant that's sitting on top of my head that's invisible, because I know that's not possible. I would be crushed if there's an actual elephant. And then if we say weightless elephant, we're going to start getting away from what actually an elephant is anyway. But I cannot get myself there because there's too many things that determine how I think. And that's one thing, reason and logic. It would be unreasonable for me to make random assumptions like there could be an elephant that is lightweight and invisible that just happened to be on top of my head. And therefore, I can't just choose to think in particular kinds of ways. What this means, though, if I understand it right, is that being determined wouldn't impact its truth condition either, because I could just be determined to think in certain kinds of ways. And these kinds of ways could be truth apt, like reason and logic. So I think this is a real problem, particularly for connection A. This other point 3 would be that determined minds and free minds are on equal footing in terms of their epistemic background. And this is going to particularly target connection B. And there's no conceptual space that a free mind can go to appeal to and assess the truth condition the determined mind cannot. I don't know why we can't think that we reason or have logic in a determined state of universe, even if we make them sort of non-determined in the sense of how logic and reason should operate is independent of the particular states of the world. It seems completely fine to think that I could be forced to end up following or acknowledging logic or reason based on how my mind was evolved to end up being sensitive to logic or reason, and this will determine how I think. We are forced to be somewhat reasonable, somewhat logical all the time. I'm saying somewhat because, people make a mistake all the time. It's to be really odd to think that we're always that way. So I would love to know in what way the free mind, according to unapologetic apologetics, can access, say, logic in a way that the determined mind can't. If we characterize as logic as non-determined, then it just so happens we're determined to think about logic and be, decently good at it. If that's the case, then that's all the determinism we need. It's not like determinism operates such that it'll pick out the belief. Determinism is that there's going to be a set of processes and a set of chain of reactions that make us think a certain way. It might just be the case that our minds are constructed to be very, very prone to reasoning and, say, very prone to being logical, such that we thereby go through that to determine what we believe afterward. And sometimes we will make mistakes. Sure, that happens all the time. But of course, that's going to be true independent of a free or determined world, because that's just how the world is right now. We know people make mistakes in reason or logic all the time. There's no principled reason to think that we shouldn't just be determined to often think in those ways. And if that's the case, the only difference we have between determinism and free will, based on what types of modes of thought we have, is how we get to our beliefs. Either in the free will case, we choose to reason or logic and we adopt it that way, or in the determinism case, we're determined to use those things often when we think. And that ends up determining whether we adopt a belief or not. That these, what he calls modes of thought that are independent of cause and effect, are determined ways that we think. Again, I'm not saying determined as in we will always think that way. I'm saying that we are determined to often think that way. And mostly that it seems that unapologetic apologetics has this idea in mind that if determinism is true, what our beliefs are going to be set in stone, and those won't go through first logic or reason or be subject to be checked by them, because they'll be set in stone thereby from, like, the states of the world, and then the states of the world shouldn't track logic or reason. But it could just be that we are forced to be cognizant of logic and reason all the time, and then we're going to think of that way and be apt or sensitive to those modes of thought that aren't directly related to cause and effect. It just so happens that we are caused to think in those ways. Of course, you might still be thinking that, wow, it's a really big coincidence that determinism allowed us to track things like, reason and logic. Why would we be determined to think using those modes of thought that end up forcing us to believe one way or another? I'm going to argue point 4 that there's no coincidence that our determined minds are roughly truth sensitive, because our brains are evolved from natural selection. And it's the general point that if brains are reliably assessing data about the world, then they'll have a competitive advantage in survival. And logic and reason being useful for assessing things like threat management and what to do in very difficult situations and learning about the world, then we should expect that brains become better at that, and that was a way that we might have evolved. That we are evolved to be very sensitive to logic and reason because it was beneficial for our survival. So there's no coincidence that deterministically we ended up thinking in a way that's in line with logic and reason, but rather it seems very expected that in a determined universe that we think that way. Because if we didn't think that way, we would not be very good at surviving, and we would never gotten to the place that we are now. We've never become, a very successful world spread out species if we weren't able to reliably assess the world that is independent of our minds. If we couldn't access objective truth, then we probably would have died a lot more frequently. And so we should expect that there's no coincidence that our brains end up using things like logic and reason that are independent of cause and effect in a very, very minute way, that we are determined to think that way, because otherwise we'd be a lot more prone to death. And so we should expect that there's a lining up between how our determined minds work and cause and effect and truth, because we are evolved to have that type of mind. We are evolved to be able to double check our mind against just our simple observations or our background based on things like logic and reason, because they're useful for survival. And the final point I have is that even if we accept his argument, even if all my first 4 points are wrong and that there is a problem, that we can't exactly reach objective knowledge, that we can't have knowledge of the objective reality, then all we could conclude from this point is that my cat just jumped up if you saw my camera shake, because I have both my cats on my desk. Not important. Cats are cats. Even if his argument is true, then all we should be able to conclude is that, oh God, we don't know objective truth. That sucks. It seems that the main motivator here is that we want to be able to say that we know objective truth. But it seems more likely to me to withhold judgment on whether we know objective truth or not than to appeal to things like entities like God to make a metaphysically strange claim like free will to get the outcome that we like, that we have knowledge. That is not how proper thinking works. It's not based on what we want. The world could just be not what we want. It could be the case that we are not suited for having knowledge. But that's a problem for the world, and us, have to make in terms of that if his argument is true. Now, I don't think his argument is true. And in fact, I think it's really important to note that if free will is true, we have other really big problems. That in fact, if we want freedom in the kind of sense it's important to us, I think we have to be determined. I can do this in another video. It's not important for this one. But overall, that whether or not my first arguments are correct, that doesn't lead us to the conclusion that we should go, okay, a God exists, because we want to be able to say we have knowledge. Rather, we should either think, okay, maybe I don't know if I have knowledge, and that's fine. Whether or not, we can't just assume that we have that knowledge. We have to be able to demonstrate that. And I don't know how he could demonstrate we have knowledge without going through a mode of thought that I think is compatible with determinism to show that we have that knowledge, which would end up just probably showing that determinism and knowledge are compatible in their own right. After presenting the determinism argument, Unapologetic Apologetics spends a very long time sort of constructing all the different, or putting all the different ways you could think about objective morality, objective truth, and materialistic determinism into like a chart and, make all the different positions that you could come with. I'm not going to address all the different ones because I think it's a waste of my time. In fact, I'm just going to address the one that is ultimately my position, which is that we take the position that one considers there is objective truth that is knowable, accepts materialistic determinism, and rejects objective morality. He ends up rejecting my entire position, or my way of thinking about the world, because he relies and falls back upon the determinism argument. But if my arguments are true, then we shouldn't accept the determinism argument and think that, in fact, we can know about objective truth because we are determined to think in ways that are sensitive to objective truth. Because of materialistic determinism seems likely true. I also think we should object objective morality, but that's, the project of my dissertation, and why I think morality is still important and relevant is a whole different spiel. But ultimately, he cannot show that there's a problem in his position without the determinism argument. The determinism argument doesn't work because there's no connection between how we are going to be confident in our beliefs and whether or not we have the ability to choose how we think. Determinism is ultimately about choice. Whether it's true or not. Either we're determined and we don't have choices and we're just forced to think in certain ways, but then we could just be forced to think in ways that are true sensitive, and that seems likely based on evolution. Just because logic and reason seem independent of cause and effect doesn't mean we can't be determined to be sensitive to thinking in those ways, and then that's the relevant type of determinism. Determinism is not the claim that I will think that my cat is beautiful irrespective of logic and reason from the starting point of the world, but rather I will, there will be all these cases I end up getting a cat, and then I will go, wow, here's what I think beauty is. Well, maybe beauty is a bad example because, those aren't objective standards either way, but I might end up thinking that my cat has 4 paws objectively in the world. And it seems very likely that it's just because, look, I end up having a cat. It's very useful for me to assess other beings in the world based on their threat level. And I can go, okay, that thing has 4 paws, but they're very small. And I trim the nails so they're not going to scratch me. I can know all these things about objective reality because they're useful for my survival, even if I'm determined to think that way. Overall, I don't think that he has a very strong argument against determinism, meaning that we can't know things. And even if it does, again, it doesn't mean that we have a problem that we need to appeal to God for, but rather the world is sadly not the way we want it to be, which is not something to reject, because whether the world is the way we want it doesn't mean whether or not it's true. But of course, I think I've addressed everything here. If I have any problems or something, please point them out to me in the comments and I'll try to address them. Maybe you'll make a second video to fix any mistakes, because I've gone quick. I've done so many retakes that I ended up just getting angry at myself and stepped back so many times. So there's a good chance that I just said, you know what, let me go here. This is my first video, so maybe I'll have to redo it or fix it. But I think I've done a pretty good job. Please let me know, and I'll see you guys maybe in another video. Hopefully, I want to keep this channel going. See you on the flip side.